Hello students, today we will be discussing about foreign policy. In the last lecture we discussed about national and comprehensive national power. There is a close link between national power and foreign policy, because if you have power but you do not have a policy to utilize that power, so it does not make much sense. So in that way foreign policy and national power, they are closely related to each other. We will proceed on our discussion on foreign policy in this way. First we will discuss about the background, then what is the whole concept of foreign policy, we will discuss that. Then we will be talking of foreign policy decision making, and then what are the determinants for foreign policy. So we will start with the background first. The making of foreign policy has traditionally been regarded as one of the key features of international politics. If any nation has to pursue any policy, or if any nation has to secure its national objectives or national interests, so it needs a foreign policy so that would help it to achieve its national interest and national goals. It reflects the importance of statecraft as an activity through which national governments manage their relations with other states and international bodies. So basically it is a kind of statecraft that is used by the government for dealing with other countries and international bodies such as the United Nations or WTO. Indeed, foreign policy making has sometimes been thought of as a noble activity, seen as high politics, in that it deals with issues of sovereignty and security. In fact, the very survival of the state is dependent on your foreign policy, as opposed to the low politics of economics and other less important state activities. So those who think of foreign policy, they make a distinction between the high politics and the low politics, and basically they argue that foreign policy is all about the high politics of security, sovereignty, survival. It has nothing to do with low politics areas such as economics or maybe environmental issue, or maybe something like trade issues. So that was the earlier distinction. However, recent developments have called the concept of foreign policy into question, certainly casting doubt on the conventional notion of foreign policy as a discrete activity engaged in at a very senior political level and involving formal diplomatic interactions between and among the states. So this conventional notion of foreign policy, that it deals with the high politics, and it deals with the interactions of a state with another state, or policy of one state against the other, they are now being questioned, because most of the events for the last so many decades, they have made this kind of distinction, this kind of notion as something outdated. These pressures have came from various directions. So there are lots of pressures, issues that made this whole concept of foreign policy as a kind of foreign policy dealing with hard issues, dealing with the international actors. It has nothing to do with the domestic politics. So this whole notion of foreign policy, that has been questioned, and there are so many reasons for that. As Walters and others argued, state behavior could essentially be explained through the power balance that shape the international system. Thus, logic of anarchy explained everything. So this is the first change, that change the notion of foreign policy as something very exclusive domain of the executive, something very related to the senior political level, and it all relates to diplomatic interaction between and among the states. Because if you look at the structure of international relations, you find there are a lot of issues like balance of power. There are a lot of factors that shape the international system, and so the logic of anarchy that explains everything, in the sense that you are not very autonomous in dealing with the foreign policy issues, because in fact you are responding to the nature of international relations or nature of international system that exists at a particular point of time. So that was the argument of neo-realists like Walters. Moreover, pressures have been generated by the advance of globalization and the growth of complex interdependence. We have discussed on these issues, that how globalization, interdependence, interconnectedness, how these issues they have widened and deepened the scope of interactions between and among the states and other international actors. So there are so many actors now, nations are more closely integrated with each other, because of economic reasons, because of globalization, because of interdependence, because of vulnerability. So there are so many issues that has actually affected the way states formulated the foreign policy, and it has in fact increased the scope of interactions between and among the states, and also they are also interacting with other actors in international politics, particularly the regional and national supra-governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, transnational organizations. So there are so many developments that have affected our notion of foreign policy, our understanding of foreign policy. So it is not just not a kind of activity or not a kind of act that is related to few officials of Ministry of Foreign Affairs or top diplomats. Rather it has become very complex, and because we are dealing with so many issues for international politics. So the pressure of globalization and the growth of complex interdependence, they have made the states more closely related to each other, closely linked to each other, and they have also made the states vulnerable and dependent on each other. So that means the whole concept of foreign policy as a kind of activity related to only top diplomats of the country or maximum to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, these concepts have all become outdated because of this kind of globalization, because of complex interdependence. The scope of state interaction has widened, and it has in fact kind of interaction that is not related to the states with the other states, rather it is related to the states, other states and in other international actors. The distinction between home and abroad, inside and outside, and high and low politics became perhaps hopelessly hazy. The divide between foreign politics and domestic politics became increasingly difficult to sustain. So, because of all these developments, because of globalization, because of complex interdependence, because of the logic of anarchy. So, because of all these reasons, the kind of earlier division between foreign politics and domestic politics, low politics and high politics, inside the home and outside the home. So these all notions have become difficult to sustain. This explains how Henry Kissinger's often quoted submission that in foreign policy analysis, the domestic structure is taken as given as foreign policy begins where domestic politics ends. How this whole notion of the division between domestic politics and international politics has now become outdated because of the recent developments. If the notion of foreign policy is meaningless, can foreign policy any longer exist? That is the question. The matter is made more problematic because of the globalization trends that have also been associated with the advance of post-sovereign governance, or what we call the global governance, and the growing importance of non-state actors such as the transnational corporations, non-governmental organizations, terrorist and other violent organizations, international organizations, so on. So these are the kind of organizations, they have become influential now in international politics. So states are not supposed to interact with other states only, rather they have to deal with host of other institutions and organizations at the international level. So in this context, we can say that at the very least, this meant that foreign policy can no longer be thought of simple as what the states they do or they are doing with the other states. So it's not just a kind of state to state interaction, rather a kind of broader interaction with the other state actors and non-state actors at the international level. Nevertheless, the study of foreign policy of the states remain a worthwhile activity, at least for two important reasons. First, the state is the only institution that in a true sense of the term provides the large scale of services to the citizens, such as regulating the economy, providing welfare services, ensuring law and order, and defending the country from the internal threats and outside threats. So this is the first reason why states are important and why we need a kind of policy for their survival, for their security, for attaining prosperity. Second, the state formulates and implements the foreign policy in a proper sense. There is United Nations, there is Al Qaeda, there is many other non-governmental organizations, but they don't formulate the kind of foreign policy we are going to talk about. So basically, there are other actors, no doubt about that, but the United Nations is not supposed to formulate a foreign policy the way the states are supposed to do. So that is the reason why international relations resolve around the states formulating and implementing foreign policy. So how the states are formulating the policy, how they are implementing the policy, that is the main concern of international politics. So in that way, we have to understand how foreign policy as a concept and as a tool for analyzing the behavior of the states is important for the students of international politics. Now let us discuss about the meaning of foreign policy. What is foreign policy all about? In simple term, when we use the word foreign, it shows that the target of action is external relations or international arena, whereas the word policy implies that the actions are rational and based on purposive decisions. So when we say foreign policy, it means two words, and two words have different meaning. The first foreign means simple terms, when you say foreign, it means external, it's not something related to your internal politics. And second, when you say policy, it means we are talking of some kind of decisions, some kind of objectives that are to be taken by the state for achieving those objectives. Foreign policy may be defined as general objectives that guide the activities and relationship of one state in its interactions with other states and actors. So basically, when we are talking of foreign policy, simply you can think that we are talking about some objectives, and those objectives are very general, and that guides the state activities of the kind of interaction they are engaged in with other states and other actors in international politics. So they are the general objectives, and the purpose of those objectives is to guide the state action in dealing with other states, in dealing with other actors in international politics. Some of the workable definitions of foreign policy used in the literature include broader definitions such as a set of actions or rules governing the action of an independent political authority deployed in the international environment. So basically, some relate foreign policy with the states, and the foreign policy is basically understood as a set of actions or rules that governs the state behavior at the international level. Others draw attention to the role of the state as the agent of foreign policy and define the concept as a sum total of official external relations conducted by an independent actor, usually a state, in international relations. So others consider the role of the state as basically as an agent of foreign policy, because you have a defined objective, and the state here is understood as an agent that define the kind of interactions that it has to be engaged in with other actors and non-state actors. Foreign policy might also be defined as not merely the action itself, but as the underlying vision that also includes a specific role conception that informs and advises the state action. So it is not just the action itself, rather what is your vision, what exactly you want to achieve, what are your goals. So these are all important for understanding foreign policy as a concept. Foreign policy is about the outside world. This is the fact that the structure, agents and context covered by foreign policy are beyond the political border of a state. So basically, this is a very traditional kind of definition that when we talk about foreign policy, we talk about the outside world, and we are talking about the structure, the agents and the context covered by foreign policy, and those structures, agents and context are basically outside the defined border of the state. Thus, foreign policy of a nation includes so many things. First, a set of principles, policies and decisions. This is number one. Second, objectives, goals and interests. Third, means to be used. What kind of means you are going to use for achieving those objectives. Assessment of the gains and failures. So what you have done and what you have got, and is there is a need to revise your strategy, is there a need to evaluate your strategy, and the policies, decision and action programs. So once you come to know that what strategy you adopted, what goals you wanted, and once you evaluate those goals and strategies, then you may revise your policies, decisions and action programs. So foreign policy is usually understood as a kind of state policy, not only just for the for dealing with other states at the international level, rather both with the state actors and other non-state actors, and basically this is a kind of tool that helps the country to achieve its goals vis-a-vis the state actors and non-state actors. Now let us discuss about the foreign policy decision making. This is the process of making foreign policies, how foreign policy is made. This process includes three stages. The first is called the foreign policy initiation stage, the second is called policy formulation stage, and the third is called the policy implementation stage. The initial stage is when the political leaders, most probably the head of the state or government, and the foreign policy bodies led by the Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you can say that depending upon the country you are discussing, conceive of foreign policy ideas. They are premised on national interest, perceptions, preferences, choices, options and capabilities. So this is the initial stage, that when you think of a policy, this is basically a kind of idea that is initiated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and when you basically discuss these ideas, these all ideas are based on your national interest, your perceptions, your preferences, the choices, options, capability, what you are capable of. Are you really capable of achieving those objectives? Are you really thinking of your national interest? Is that policy going to serve your national interest? So there are so many questions that you have to discuss at the initial period of foreign policy making. This is also known as the stage of identification and articulation of roles, or the role conception stage. This is which strategic and practical steps can be taken to realize national interest in international politics. So basically, as I said, when we initiate any idea, when we think of any policy, we discuss that at the preliminary level, and these are all discussed and initiated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of a particular country, and they take into account so many variables, so many factors, and then they think of how that is going to serve your national interest, if that is initiated or if that is formulated. The second stage is called the formulation of policies. In a democratic country like India, formulation requires sending the proposal to Parliament for debate, readings and adoption, after which it returns to the executive for approval and ratification. Basically in the second stage, whatever idea is formulated, whatever idea is initiated, that is debated, that is discussed, and sometimes it goes to the Parliament, and once it is approved and ratified, then it becomes a kind of policy, or there is a broad agreement on that policy. But this is not always happening, because most of the time the executive formulate the policy, and it actually proceeds with that policy, and there are very few cases when you go to the Parliament for approval. So second stage is basically not followed in most of the countries. The third stage is implementation. At this stage, the executive engages the foreign ministry and all other relevant ministries to ensure execution of a policy. So once you agree with the broad policy guidelines, once you take the decision, then the next step is your implementation, and how it is implemented. Particularly, it is the executive that has the primary responsibility of foreign policy of a country, and once executive agrees with certain policy decisions, then the foreign ministry and other relevant ministries are engaged in executing that kind of policy. So the execution of that policy depends on several ministries, but it is the Ministry of External Affairs that takes the lead on those issues or on the implementation of a particular policy. The foreign ministry in particular engages the foreign service made up with political and career diplomats, as well as envoys and other diplomatic field staff, to work on the policy or policies. The implementation stage may also be known as the role assumption stage. So when it comes to the implementation stage, it is not just the ministry, rather there are so many diplomats, there are so many, in case of India, there are so many, career diplomats, those who are selected through the Indian Foreign Service, and they are engaged in different kind of diplomatic activities, and they are the people who really play an important role for executing the policy. So and this kind of once it is discussed, so once the idea is floated, then it is discussed, debated. If it is a not a very secret kind or very confidential kind of issue, then it is widely debated, discussed in the media, in the press, in the parliament, then the opposition is consulted. So there are so many processes involved in making the policy for foreign policy making, and it starts with the senior level, it starts with the Ministry of External Affairs, then it is all all in the whole process. So many stakeholders are consulted for formulating, implementing and executing a kind of policy for a particular country. So many actors are involved in the initial stage, in the formulation of policies and in the execution of a policy once agreed. What should be the policy and how it should be implemented, with what context, with what actors and institutions. Scholars add another important stage in foreign policy making, which is called the evaluation and the review stage. In this stage, policymakers evaluate the outcome and effectiveness of the foreign policy initiative, especially whether the policy achieved its stated goals, whether it has improved the national security situation, enhanced the diplomatic relationship with other countries, promoted economic interest or contributed to international stability. So basically, this refers to the way foreign policy objectives are achieved, whether the national interest is served or not. Based on the evaluation, policymakers gather feedback from stakeholders, including diplomats, experts and the public. Lessons learned from the implementation processes are then analyzed to inform future foreign policy decisions. Depending on the evaluation findings, policymakers may decide to adjust the current policy, terminate ineffective initiatives or maintain successful strategies for ongoing or new challenges. These four stages illustrate the comprehensive process through which states develop, implement and assess their foreign policies to navigate international relations, protect national interest and contribute to global stability and cooperation. Each stage requires careful consideration, strategic thinking and effective coordination to ensure that foreign policy initiatives align with broader national objectives and priorities. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We discussed that foreign policy making is often regarded as a noble activity and categorized under the high politics section because it involves decisions and actions that directly impact a nation's security, sovereignty and prosperity. Recent developments have challenged the conventional notion of foreign policy as a discrete and separate activity due to several interconnected factors such as globalization and interdependence, emergence of non-state actors, technological advancements, particularly the social media platforms that amplify voices and mobilize public opinion on international issues, what we have seen during the time of Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj, shifts in global power dynamics, especially the rise of emerging powers and regional blocs, which challenging the dominance of traditional Western powers, new and evolving security threats such as cyber attacks, hybrid warfare and transnational crime, which underscore the need for a more integrated and holistic approach to global governance, where foreign policy is intertwined with domestic policy considerations, societal values and global responsibilities. Despite this, the study of foreign policy remains a worthwhile activity, as the state is the only institution which provides its citizens with the broadest scale of services, and the state also formulates and implements the foreign policy in the true sense of the term. While definitions of foreign policy may vary slightly depending on the perspective or the theoretical framework used, there are common features that generally appear across most definitions of foreign policy. They especially include government action, the decisions and strategies undertaken by governments or state actors in relation to other states and international actors, external relations like the state's external relations and interactions with other sovereign countries, international organizations and other social actors. They include the government action, the decisions and strategies undertaken by governments or state actors in relation to other states and international actors, external relations like the state's external relations and interactions with other sovereign states, international organizations and other actors, national interest, the pursuit of security, economic prosperity, national identity and the promotion of ideological or cultural values that guide a country's foreign policy. Strategy and diplomacy. Strategic planning and diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving specific foreign policy goals and flexibility and adaptability, making foreign policy adaptable to changing global circumstances, including the shift in international relations, emerging threats, technological advancements and socio-economic developments. We discussed that there are 4 stages of foreign policy making: the initiation or the formulation stage, the implementation stage and the evaluation and the review stage, which illustrate the comprehensive process through which states develop, implement and assess their foreign policies to navigate international relations, protect national interest and contribute to global stability and cooperation. In the next lecture, we will discuss the determinants of foreign policy or the factors that influence the foreign policy of a particular nation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you and goodbye.